Come on, Jason, sit down. Where have you been? Class is almost over. Hey, I'm talking to you. Where's your pass?
I'm sorry, you saying something?
You heard me. Look, I'll forget about the pass if you open your book to page 89. We're reading chapter 6 this period. Jason, open your book. Now!
Are you saying anything worth my time at all?
Damn it, Jason, I'm trying to run a class here. Now, open your book and be quiet or I'll drag your butt out of here.
Not by yourself, you won't. Maybe you should get some more wimps in here before you want to mess with...
Pick up that book, now! Your assignment for tonight is to finish reading chapter 6. See you tomorrow. I have had it with Jason.
Do you want me to talk to him, Chris?
Be my guest.
Jason, hang on a second. What's your next class?
You're looking very, very nice today.
Jason, where are you supposed to be going
Oh,
now?
Mr. Craig's going to try to bore me. I'm sorry, teach me in history class next hour.
I'm hoping you're going to be less disruptive in Mr. Craig's class. I'm going to be checking with him at the end of the hour.
That's a real scary thought, too.
Think about it, Jason. Go on, you're going to be late.
Oh, and see you later, Christine.
I don't know how you take it sometimes. He just gets to me, and he knows he does. You always seem to be able to keep your cool. How do you do it? I just lose it, especially with students like him.
I learned a while back not to take anything they say personally. If I did, I'd have been out of teaching a long time ago. Chris, you're being way too hard on yourself.
Regardless of whether you work with elementary, middle school, or high school students, at one time or another, you'll encounter belligerent, challenging, and non-compliant individuals. Why is it some educators can walk into a crisis situation and take control, be in charge, immediately establish their presence and maintain the lead, even in extremely difficult situations? How do they do it? It may appear that they accomplish this control instinctively, that their mere presence sets them apart from others and offers them command of the situation. But if you stop to analyze their body language, their tone, inflection, and overall manner, you'll notice that this perceived control is nothing more than confidence. Confidence communicated through subtle yet powerful voice intonations and calculated nonverbal actions. Because we work in education, most of us have already acquired a certain degree of expertise in interpersonal communications. With this in mind, it's easier to understand that limit setting is not so much an art as it is a skill, a craft that can be learned and honed like any other technique. The principles and techniques shown in this program will enable you to develop a framework within your personal communication style to help increase your effectiveness when handling non-compliant students. This program has 4 major objectives. It will enhance your confidence, enabling you to effectively manage non-compliant, resistive students. It will help you learn to avoid personal power struggles between yourself and non-compliant students. Show you how to develop strategies to set clear and enforceable limits. And it will sharpen your listening skills to maximize your ability to set limits. Before looking at specific techniques for setting limits, we need to briefly examine how students generally escalate to the point where it is necessary to set a limit. In any escalating crisis situation, students will generally exhibit 4 distinct and identifiable behaviors. The first level of behavior is called anxiety. Anxiety is usually characterized by some noticeable change in behavior demonstrated by a non-directed expenditure of energy. Some of the more typical anxiety behaviors are pacing, drumming of the fingers, and general edginess. A student at this behavior level is still rational and usually capable of responding to you verbally. A supportive response at this level lets the student know that you're concerned, that you'd like to help them feel better. Most situations are diffused at the anxiety level without the need to impose limits. However, at times, a student will escalate to the second level, and anxiety gives way to defensive behavior. Rational interaction at this stage will be limited. The student may become defiant, verbally aggressive, and non-compliant. A clear, directive response is best at the defensive level. The directive level is where firm, reasonable, and enforceable limits should be utilized. If the escalation continues, the student may lose total control and become physically assaultive. Nonviolent physical crisis intervention may be necessary when a student no longer responds to your verbal directives, and there is a danger of a student hurting themselves, other students, or staff. Nonviolent physical crisis intervention should always be considered as a last resort. Every crisis has a resolution called tension reduction. At this point, the student calms down and regains rational control. The tension reduction level provides an opportunity for staff to initiate therapeutic rapport. Reestablishing communication at this point can provide the basis for positive behavior change. In our discussion on setting limits, we'll focus on the highly volatile defensive level, the point in the escalation process where the student usually becomes verbally aggressive and non-compliant. To become effective at setting limits, we must recognize that students in the defensive level do not receive verbal messages in the same manner as a calm, rational student would. Human beings communicate on two levels, rational and primitive. When we are in control of our behavior, the rational form of communication predominates. We hear words, measure their logical context, and respond accordingly. However, when we become upset, threatened, or fearful, emotions we experience while in the defensive level, rational communication takes a back seat to primitive communication. Primitive communication doesn't focus on words. Rather, it keys on subtleties of territory, body language, and voice inflection. Let's look at another scenario, keeping in mind that the student may not be focusing on what the teacher is saying.
Yeah, she really said that. I mean, she kept on saying stuff to me, and
Damn it! What? I can't believe she said that. Why would she say that about me?
Calm
She's gonna
down
be
now.
sorry.
Now.
Why don't you just
Take
leave
it
me
easy,
alone?
Jackie.
What are you doing?
Take it
What are you
easy.
doing?
Just calm.
Stop.
Now, let's take another look at the same scenario, this time from Jackie's point of view. If she is communicating on a primitive level and is more focused on the teacher's body language and other subtle nonverbal cues, this is how she may perceive the interaction. Notice that without the words, the teacher's approach could easily be perceived as threatening or aggressive, when in fact, he wanted to help the student. Imagine for a moment how an approach like this would be perceived if the student had come from an abusive home environment. Remember, the first key to setting limits with a student is to realize that they are not always hearing your words. In fact, during the defensive level, they may be responding to everything but your words.
I always try to keep in mind that sometimes students don't hear what I'm saying.
If they don't hear you, how do you communicate with them when they're that hostile?
I mean, they don't hear my words, but other types of communication come through loud and clear. Like my tone of voice, for instance. I try to remember that my gestures, my distance to them is what they're focusing on. They're defensive, Chris. Everything seems like a threat when they're irrational.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Why does it seem like some educators have an innate ability to calm potentially explosive students? People who are effective in setting limits and diffusing confrontations have their own personal formulas or styles. But what do these individuals have in common? In addition to being confident, there are fundamental characteristics that effective limit setters have in common. They have the ability to avoid personal power struggles, establish clear, objective limits, and consistently enforce the consequences of those limits. And they have the ability to listen actively. Let's examine each of these characteristics, beginning with the ability to avoid power struggles. A power struggle is literally an emotional landmine. It is non-productive, and it destroys your ability to effectively set limits and gain compliance. One of the most common forms of power struggles is one which begins by a student challenging your authority and credibility. Your attitude in a confrontational situation is critical. In many cases, the student is testing you to see if you are in charge of the situation. Any display of defensiveness on your part will tend to escalate the conflict and reduce your chances of gaining compliance.
Okay, guys. Guys, settle down. Guys. Now, I have your assignments here from Mr. Carter. I want you to open your books to page 73 and do problems 10, 12, and 14.
Hey, Mr. Carter always lets us talk before class.
Well, I'm running class today. Now, please do your assignment.
Ooh, Miss Brent, the teacher's in charge of class today. Watch out.
Now, hey, I have been substituting for 6 years now. Mr. Laughlin has been subbing for, 6 months? And he never gets this kind of garbage. I know what I'm doing.
Yeah, right.
Now, you will follow my directions. I'm in charge here.
By defending or justifying your position as an educator, you automatically lose control of the verbal interaction. In fact, you may be encouraging the same type of behavior from that student in the future. Try not to take a defensive posture. Remember, you don't have to justify your authority. The second type of power struggle is called personal button pushing.
Hey, aren't you supposed to be in class? I asked you a question. Aren't you supposed to be in class? Look, if you don't want to answer, we can take a walk down to the office.
What's the matter, Mr. Sorensen? Are we having a bad hair day?
How dare you? Now look, young lady, you stay out of my personal affairs. How I look is none of your business. Now you move down to Busby's office. Move!
We all have personal issues we're uncomfortable with. Defensive students are very good at discovering these buttons. If we allow them to become an issue, we have lost control. Once again, you must not allow the attention to shift from the student's behavior to yourself. The third type of power struggle is when limits are set, but the student knows the consequences cannot be enforced.
Hey, Greg, let's go. Let's get dressed for class. Everybody's out there. Something wrong, Greg?
Leave me alone.
Greg.
Get out of my face.
Hey, lower your
Go
voice.
bother somebody else. I don't feel like going.
Look, you get dressed for class now and get out to the gym. If you're not out there in 3 minutes, I'll come back here and drag you out.
Go ahead. Try it. I'll sue your ass.
Students know all too well what you can and can't do. Take a moment to think before issuing a consequence. Unenforceable threats and ultimatums only make your task more difficult. The fourth type of power struggle involves irrelevant issues.
Carrie, this is the 3rd time this week you haven't turned in your assignment. Is there a reason?
No reason.
I spoke to your mom today. She says you're the same way at home. You don't do your work around the house. She says she's having problems now with your brother because he won't do his chores either.
Paul's a jerk anyway.
Well,
He gets away with murder, and my dad always believes him. Have you ever met my dad?
well, no.
Irrelevant